What would you do if you discovered that a small change of just 6 millimeters could turn your car into a contender to the title? This was the surprise that Frédéric Vasseur and Ferrari took when analyzing Lewis Hamilton's car in Mugello. What seemed a routine test became a revolutionary moment for the 2025 season. Ferrari was caught between two worlds. On the one hand, his glorious past demanded immediate results. On the other, the reality of a modern Formula One where milliseconds are built with years of millimeter planning. Vasseur knew it. He had promised a renewed Ferrari, away from the chaos of mistakes in boxes, from unlikely strategies, of constant frustration. But after the first race, the same ghost of the disappointment was floating in the paddock. It was in that context of doubt, pressure, and overflowing expectations that a test session was planned that would change the course of Ferrari's recent history. A simple filming day without cameras or press ended up revealing a discovery that could rewrite the fate of the season. But that moment of revelation was yet to come. What happened in Mugello that July 17, 2025 was not in the plans. There were no expectations, there was no press, there were no long stint simulations or maximum load configurations for classification batches. It was a simple filming day, a filming session to capture promotional images of the SF25. That's all. But in Formula One, the extraordinary happens when nobody expects it. While the sun fell on Tuscany, Ferrari was about to dig up something that would change its season radically. The engineers displaced to Mugello barely had a small team, the minimum indispensable for this type of days. But the car that rolled that day, piloted by Lewis Hamilton, was not exactly the same that had behaved erratically in Melbourne. It had an experimental specification of the rear suspension, one that until that time had only been studied in digital simulations, without practical track validation. This redesigned system changed the anchor point of the upper trapeze directly on the housing of the gearbox, a subtle but structural modification that completely reconfigured the kinematics of the rear axle. The theory was simple. If the rear train could work at a lesser height without generating rebound or loss of traction, the aerodynamics of the flat bottom would be automatically enhanced. But nobody expected the SF25 to roll up to 6 millimeters lower without showing symptoms of instability, much less in a technical layout like Mugello, full of fast curves such as Casanova Savelli or the infamous Arrabbiata 2. The data began to arrive in Maranello almost in real time. Frédéric Vasseur, who followed remote telemetry, could not give credit to what he was seeing. Lewis Hamilton was achieving minimum curve speeds between 5 and 6 kilometers per hour higher than his best previous records. And I did it in non-ideal conditions. Demonstration tires without fresh classification gums, without the maximum performance motor map. It was like seeing how a car in another category had been mysteriously inserted into the same chassis. But that was not the most shocking. The really groundbreaking was the dynamic stability of the car. The rear axle height variation was reduced to only 1.4 millimeters, when in the previous tests it did not fall from 4 millimeters, even with maximum stiffness settings. In addition, Hamilton's rear brakes managed to maintain a thermal delta within plus or minus 12 degrees Celsius. This, in conditions of advertising filming, was almost impossible. It meant that the airflow was being channeled so clean that it allowed uniform and constant cooling in full demand. The engineers began to review each setup variable. They wanted to find an anomaly, an error, a technical explanation that invalidated the results. But there was no trap or error. What they were seeing was real. The redesign had completely transformed the behavior of the SF25 into a fast curve and had unlocked aerodynamic efficiency that had until then kidnapped by the previous car's own design. Hamilton also felt it on the steering wheel. His piloting, fine and meticulous, was for the first time in total synchrony with a Ferrari. The steering wheel inputs translated into precise chassis answers. The car responded to the changes of direction with an agility that remembered the best times of Mercedes W11. And this was getting it without the power maps that Ferrari reserves only for classification. Mugello's session, which should be a formality, ended up becoming a technical gold mine. Vasseur immediately ordered a complete investigation, not to find failures, but to understand why this improvement had not manifested before. A re-engineering plan was drawn to accelerate the complete implementation of the new suspension scheme in both SF25 units for the next major awards. It was no longer just an evolution of performance. It was a revolution that put Ferrari again in the fight. In a matter of hours, Mugello had ceased to be a simple recording test. It had become the epicenter of a silent but deep transformation. The car had changed. The perception of the team had changed. And maybe, just maybe, so had done the fate of the whole season. Frédéric Vasseur is not a man who is easily carried out by emotion. His training as an engineer has trained him to distrust the impulses and always seek the empirical validation of each phenomenon. But that afternoon in Mugello, even he could not hide his shocked state. The metrics that came from telemetry were so unexpected, so forceful, that all previous patterns of the SF-25 broke. It was as if, suddenly, the car would have woken up. As if the DNA of a car for mediocrity had mutated in real time towards that of a true contender to the title. The first reaction of the team was the astonishment. In Maranello, analysts could not understand how a configuration they had modeled in simulators and test banks without extraordinary results. Suddenly, it worked on the track with surgical precision. The difference was in the execution. The data now flowed coherence. The aerodynamic load was developed efficiently from the flat bottom to the diffuser. The advanced resistance was minimal. The car gained stability without sacrificing speed, an almost impossible balance to reach in modern Formula One. And all thanks to a lower appearance modification. But not only were it numbers, the energy of the equipment also changed. In the boxes, in the internal emails, in the technical meetings, a word that until then had been taboo in Ferrari, Esperanza began to circulate. For the first time in a long time, the engineers stopped speaking in conditional. It was no longer about, if we manage to improve the rebound, or, if we can find high-speed balance. Now, with evidence in hand, they could affirm that the car had a new base behavior. And that behavior was competitive. Hamilton, on the other hand, immediately perceived the difference. His experience of decades at the highest level allowed him to read between the lines. What he had felt in Mugello was not a passenger flash. It was a solid base. His body language when he got out of the car said everything. There was trust. And that trust quickly resulted in a new position in technical meetings. More involved, more incisive, more optimistic. Although Ferrari had arrived knowing that the first year would be adaptation, this improvement returned the illusion of being able to fight for victories sooner than expected. Internally, Vasseur did not waste time. He summoned those responsible for aerodynamics, suspension, and data analysis to begin an immediate total integration plan of the new system. I knew they could not wait for the usual update calendar. If they wanted to capitalize on this advantage, it had to be implemented before the next racing tour in Asia, a stage where historically Ferrari suffered due to lack of thermal efficiency and where management on hot paths. Beyond the technical plane, Mugello's revelation also had strategic implications. The team began to redesign its development calendar. New pieces were prioritized that would complement the new equilibrium of the car. More efficient soils, modifications to the diffuser, even a new setup philosophy based on greater aggressiveness in rear compression. The car was no longer the same. And that required complete rethinking. And then there is the psychological impact. Not only inside the team but on the grill. The rivals soon noticed that Ferrari came with something new. In the following free sessions, the sensors placed in McLaren and Mercedes cars began to analyze the behavior of the SF-25 in greater detail. The development war had lit. And Mugello was the spark. In a sport where the margins are thousands, where each team obsessively pursues any microvantage, what Ferrari found was not one more adjustment. It was a paradigm shift. An accidental discovery that, if consolidated, can mark the beginning of a new era for the rampant Cavallino. In silence, far from the reflectors, Ferrari may have found his ticket back to the top. Now, everything depends on what they do with him. Because in modern Formula One, discovering something is not enough. You have to execute it perfectly. And fast. What happened in Mugello might seem like a small point on the map of an extensive and complex season such as Formula One. But if something has taught this category is that the seasons do not decide only on Sunday's checkered flag. They are decided at dawn at the factory, in the data hidden in a curve, in an experimental piece that behaves like none before. And that was exactly what Ferrari lived. What Lewis Hamilton felt in that car was not just a good day of testing. It was the first indication of something much bigger. The possibility of finally found the competitive nucleus that had escaped between their fingers. That is why we are now faced with one of the great questions of the 2025 season. Can Ferrari consolidate this technical advance and turn it into real victories, solid points, and, eventually, a struggle for the title? The history of the team is full of promising moments that were then diluted in strategic errors, bad decisions, or simple execution failures. The finding of Mugello is a powerful weapon, but it is not automatic. It's just the beginning. The key will be able to reproduce that configuration in career conditions, under pressure, with the real wear of a full weekend and facing rivals who are not going to remain still. And this is where I want to open the question. Do you think Ferrari has found a sustainable technical solution? Can Hamilton use this advance as a platform to recover the domain he had in the Mercedes era? Or will we see again how a golden opportunity is diluted in bureaucracy and chronic errors that have characterized Cavallino in recent years?